Hey guys, we're going to talk about chisels today, one of the most important homestead tools there is. I've done a few other videos on homestead tools, and tonight we're talking just about chisels and go over kind of a quick what you need, what you should have, and how to take care of them, restore them, etc. Now, you don't need a ton for chisels, guys, and you don't need to spend a fortune either. Now, I have a couple different things. Like, number one, I have this DeWalt construction chisel. It's basically a chisel. It's got a little side chisel with some serrations. This is something primarily used for demolition, for breaking things up. Not something you're going to use for fine woodworking. It's pretty tough. It's heavy duty. I've used it out in the woods doing some making some bushcraft furniture and stuff like that. It's kind of handy for that too, because you can really get in and smooth out some notches if you're making some rustic furniture on a long trip. We got stuff like this. This is just a modern Harbor Freight 1/4 inch, small little one with the plastic handle. Really cheap, really inexpensive. Really super soft steel. They don't hold an edge worth nothing. You got a couple of these socket chisels. You got some other chisels in here with handles. All different kinds of stuff. So what you need is basically, you only need about 4 or 5 chisels. And primarily what you're going to need is something around a 1/4 inch, like this Harbor Freight here. You're going to want something around a 1/2 inch, which I think this one here is pretty close to a 1/2 inch. Something that's more along the lines of 3/4 of an inch, which I think this one is 3/4. Real nice chisel. Love this chisel. I use this a lot. I use it a lot. And then a larger, maybe a 1 to 2 inch chisel. 1 inch is nice, a 1.5 is nice, maybe a 2. Depends on what you can find out there. Primarily, you're going to use chisels for woodworking. Your socket chisel kind of things here, and your Harbor Freight ones you can use for woodworking. This DeWalt one I just kind of threw out because it was for demolition kind of thing. That's kind of a specialty thing. You want to make sure you don't cross the two of them. Your DeWalt's not going to be something you're going to do fine woodworking, and vice versa. You're not going to use your nice socket chisels for demolition. People tend to do that. Chisels are seen as this impact tool that you can just beat up. That's really not the case. They are kind of designed for fine woodworking. Typically, you're going to use them to remove wood from whatever it is you're doing, whether you're cutting a notch, working on some kind of a joint for a project, or even carving like a bowl. I pulled out one of these gouges I have, and this is something you would use to, maybe carve a bowl, carve a spoon, something like that. Like I said, these are not impact tools. They're really meant to be something for fine woodworking. So the different sizes, that's about what you want. Maybe a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, inch, and then maybe one big one that's 1.5 inches or 2 inches. So it works out. I typically use them a lot. I've been getting away from doing kind of screw and glue everything that I put together nowadays, and getting into more traditional woodworking using mortise and tenon, half lap joints, dovetail joints, stuff like that. And when you do that, you're going to need tools. Primarily chisels and saws. Now, saws are a whole different story. Chisels are what you're going to use. You're going to use 2 primary operations for a chisel. One, of course, is to cut, which is when you're going to literally put it in, hit it with the back, and cut into the wood. The other is paring, which is when you kind of scrape wood up using kind of a scraping motion as opposed to a digging motion. And there's 2 types of chisels. One, like this, that has flat edges on it, and one like this that has beveled edges. The difference being, this one here can get into tighter locations because it has that bevel edge, whereas this one has that square edge. Yes, it gives a little more strength on the edge, but if you have a small tight corner you're getting into, you might not be able to get into it with this chisel. So a lot of people like to mix having bevel edge versus these straight edge ones. That's one thing to point out. Of course, length really depends on the project you're working on. If you're working on something up close and personal, these are fine. You can also attach handles to them if you need that extra distance to get away. Really cool. I love chisels. I mean, they're just one of the coolest things. Now, taking care of these. There's not much to take care of a chisel. They really are very, very simple. The most important thing is to make sure, excuse me, that the back is flat, and you do that by lapping the back. You typically are going to put that on some kind of abrasive that's going to smooth it and flatten it. This one I need to do a little better job. And then of course you're going to make sure that your actual edge is nice and straight and even. It's going to create a chisel, and these can get quite sharp. These can actually get shaving sharp and cut paper with them. Very, very easy. So there's not much. You just keep them oiled so they don't rust. But big thing is just keep that back flat and the edge there true. I don't ever like using power tools to sharpen them. I sharpen, and I'll show you real quick. Very simply, using something like this, like a diamond stone. And what I do is I would use this to flatten the back. You know, you're kind of gonna, whatever motion you see fit, you're gonna do that with the coarsest one you have, flatten the back and work your way up to a finer grit. Now typically I will start out somewhere like 100 and work up to about 1,000. Just my preference. You know, you can use a variety of different materials. You can use a diamond stone, you can use sharpening stones, you can use sandpaper, you name it. It's really up to you. Just make sure you go in a good progressive grit. Start out low, like 100, work up to 1,000. Now in a case like this, where I've already done this, you know, I'm only ever going to touch this up every once in a while with 600 or maybe 1,000, just to make sure that that edge stays nice and true along the back as I sharpen it. So that's important. As I sharpen, once again, another real simple process. You're going to match the bevel of your edge up to your stone or sandpaper or whatever it is you're using. And I typically like to draw as opposed to push. And I do that. I start at a low grit and work your way up to a very high grit. And once you get up to, you know, 600, 800, 1,000, you'll get a very smooth kind of mirror finish on it, and it will get very, very sharp. The only tricky part is keeping a very consistent angle and making sure that bevel is flat against it. I typically like the diamond stones because they're not as rough on your hand as sandpaper, and they work pretty good for this, you know. So we kind of do that. I'll draw. You know, sometimes I'll push, but I typically just draw, and I'll do that. And typically with a chisel like this, I can have the edge restored in about 20 minutes. You know, you don't have to overdo it at all. So that's it. That's simple, guys. Flatten the back. See, I did a little better job. Oh, sorry, get on camera here. A little better job flattening the back of this one. You know, then just sharpen the edge. You know, keep them oiled. They're very simple. You know, don't use them on metal. Don't use them on wood with nails. This is, you know, these are fine things. The gouges are a little more difficult to sharpen. I typically use like a chisel to try and sharpen these, but they are very tough, and you really can't flatten the backs like you would a flat one. But overall, quality is very important, guys. And getting good USA made ones at a flea market will pay off a lot more than buying the Harbor Freight ones. This right here, the edge on this is going to last exactly one job. You're going to have to sharpen it every time you use it. It's going to go dull pretty much the minute it touches wood. Something like this, which I don't even know what brand this is. It's kind of worn off, but this right here I sharpen and it stays, you can hear it, how sharp that edge is still. It's very, you can see it. You know, it catches my thumbnail at a pretty shallow angle. It's still very sharp after using this quite a bit. I only have to sharpen this every so often. It stays pretty sharp. It's really good steel. So going out, spending the time at garage sales and flea markets, you can get these, and they're pretty cheap. You're talking, typically, even if you go on eBay, you're talking $10 a piece. You know, you really only need like 4 or 5 of them for general homestead use. You know, $50 you can be set up for a generation. So I think that's real important, that these are heirloom generational tools, and just a little bit of care, occasional sharpening, and you have something you can pass down to your grandkids. So they're really important, and you know, especially if you're into homesteading, eventually you're going to get into being more and more self-reliant, doing things like making your own furniture, making your own products, and when it comes to that, chisels are what you're going to need.